Well, it's here and it's all anyone can have to talk about at the moment. Trudeau set to resign. He's going to do this resignation in the most Trudeau way possible. He's going to resign, but at the same time, he's like, but I'm going to stay on as interim prime minister until you guys can figure out a new leader. That's what's going to happen here. And we know there's all the talk. I'm not even going to try to waste too much time on it. We know what's happening. We know what's going on. The Liberal Party is going to do what they've done best up to this point, put themselves above Canadians. And we know they're going to dress it up. Well, it's incumbent upon us and Canadians to make sure we take the time to find a good leader. We need to give you an option that we're not really going to give you an option on. That is where we stand. That is where we're currently at. Yes, Trudeau's set to resign. Yes, we're starting the first steps of getting him out of here. However, it's the first step in a very long road and a long year ahead. We are likely going to see Trudeau prorogue Parliament, so that the Liberals can have their leadership race. And under our rules here in this country, Parliament only has to sit for 1 day a year. So this whole thing can be stretched out as long as they so please. And I know those who watch the show and who are in the know and know what's going on, you know this already. You know what's been going on because it's being reported everywhere at this point. It's everywhere. So we're expected a resignation either today, tomorrow, or early Wednesday. And then the Liberal Party is going to get things started in terms of getting a leadership race sorted. They have their national caucus meeting that they've scheduled for 6 hours on Wednesday. And I'm sure we'll get more answers after that meeting. But at the end of the day, as I said in my video on Saturday, no matter how this goes, no matter which way you twist it, Canadians are screwed. They are screwing Canadians actively. They are scared to be losing their jobs, scared to be losing their positions as MPs. And so now they're trying to move Trudeau out. Now they're trying to make something happen. They don't care about us. They never cared about us. It never was about us. So that's what we're seeing. That's what we're going to see happening. So that's really the issue, is our systems, how we operate. In some ways, again, makes you feel as a Canadian helpless. There is nothing really that we can do about this. They are holding us hostage. So what I've chosen to do is to look on brighter days. How can we move and call for change in such a way so that this stuff can't happen again? So that a government or a leader or anyone can hold our country hostage. That the people can hold their leader more accountable. How can we do this? Last week, me and Reg talking about how we want to try and get our hands on Pierre Poilievre's essay that he wrote in 1999. As he was finishing university. He talked about this on the Jordan Peterson podcast. Talked about how he believes in building Canada on freedom. And he wrote an essay about this and that he's been consistent on these ideas for a long time. And so a listener was awesome enough to dig up that essay for us and send it our way. And so I figured it'd be good to read this essay and grab some points out of it of what Pierre Poilievre's talking about. If this man's gonna be our next leader, let's look at the literature that he wrote while he was in university. If he really believes in these ideas he claims to be, then let's look into what he thinks could change and how we can improve freedom in this country. It's actually a pretty nice, sweet and short essay. I'm actually going to focus more on the reforms of Parliament and how our systems work in this country. Decentralizing power, being able to give more power back to the people so that they can hold their government accountable. Poilievre comes up with some interesting ideas in this essay, and it gets the ball rolling on what we can do to make sure a Trudeau never happens again. As we talked last week on a video that I did, talking about how things are going to get weird when Pierre Poilievre gets into power. Because depending on, we'll see what happens. It looks like Liberals are making some moves to try and salvage some seats. But I think we're still going to see a massive conservative majority. And in some ways, it's going to become such a big majority that the Senate could become the de facto opposition, which is not how it's supposed to work, but it could happen that way because of how Trudeau has stacked the Senate. And Poilievre had some ideas about this. And again, he wrote this in 1999. And keep in mind what was happening in 1999. Jean Chrétien was prime minister, and his Liberal Party was waning in support of the country. At this point, he was coming up on 6 years being the prime minister, and he was coming into the final leg of his time as leader. And this was the time that Pierre Poilievre wrote his essay and put forward some ideas of how things could change and operate differently so that people had more of a say what was going on in the country. He starts off by saying, Canada's parliament is currently dominated by one individual, whose party gained the confidence of only 38% of Canadians in the last election. 2/3 of the governing caucus currently represent ridings of only one province, Ontario. This leaves a large number of disenchanted voters. However, the Prime Minister has the power to ignore the interests of these people because of our bicameral system. Canada has a remarkable opportunity to remedy such democratic stagnation. My first action as Prime Minister would be to propose a completely original arrangement for the Senate. Each province would be allotted one senator, with one additional with one additional senator hailing from the territories. Elections would be held every 6 years, making it a less political body. However, concerns would arise over the fact that populous province like Ontario would have merely the same representation as PEI. To soothe this concern, I would alter the rules that determine how bills are passed into law. Any major piece of legislation would require the support of at least 7 of the senators, representing a combined 50% of the national population. Legislation would be considered important if it involved things like budgetary matters, declarations of war, national economic policy, international agreements, etc. This legislative formula is almost identical to the amending formula of the Constitution. Such a system would address all the legitimate concerns raised about other proposals for Senate reform. Critics like the Triple Senate, elected, equal, and effective, argue that it gives equal powers to provinces that have significant population disparities. Under my suggested changes, bills would require the support of at least one of Canada's 2 largest provinces, along with significant support in both the Atlantic provinces and the West. The government would have to negotiate with all regions prior to moving ahead with a major initiative. Influence over the government would derive from across the country, not just from one region, and certainly not from the Prime Minister's office. Instead of having 105 Senate seats of bloated bureaucracy and all these different groups within the Senate, there would be 14 senators. 1 from each province and 1 from each territory. And for things to pass, you had to at least have support of 7 of the 14 senators. That could be interesting. And I like the idea here of, again, the whole idea behind it is so that Ontario and Quebec can't run everything. And that is the reason behind having only 1 representative for each province. And that they would actually have to work together and come to a 50% consensus on if things will pass or not, what would pass or not. I know Reg and I have had disagreements on this in the past. Reg is a huge proponent of abolishing the Senate altogether. I am not in that camp whatsoever. I think it's important to decentralize power to a degree. I don't think we need 105 senators. However, I don't think we need to abolish the Senate. Reg believes in the idea of kind of more concentrating the powers to more of the premiers. Reg would even go as far as removing MPs, federal MPs altogether, and letting the premiers advocate for their provinces solely, and then talking to the Prime Minister's office directly. And to that idea, I understand. You'd cut a lot of bloat, a lot of bureaucracy, and there's a conversation and a debate to be had there about removing federal MPs. I'd be interested in having that more in-depth level. But I do like the idea of our Senate. I do like the idea of having a House of Commons. I like the idea of having a decentralized power. I hate that our Senate being weaponized the way it has been. I'm not a fan of that. I don't think that's helpful. However, I like the idea of having elected senators every 6 years. That would hold them accountable for what they're doing within the Senate. I would even add to that, because as we've seen the problem that's happening in the States currently, term limits. Term limits would be important as well. Decentralize the power. Operate in such a way so that the Prime Minister doesn't have as much power and say over our systems. Justin Trudeau has proven to us, and he's exposed every loophole possible to show how delicate our system is to a dictator here in this country. We move on. This is where things get a little more interesting. He says, after reforming the upper house, I would take my ease for democracy to the House of Commons. A system of voter recall would be enacted to ensure that members of parliament were accountable to their constituents. Under this system, a representative would be forced to resign and seek re-election in the event that over a period of 3 months, 40% of voters in the riding signed a recall petition. This would put voters in command of legislators, not the other way around. This is really interesting. We've talked about this. Could you imagine the residents of Papineau have had a 40% petition rate, decided, Trudeau, you need to run in your riding again. And they could actually fundamentally remove him. Yes, there's some things to talk about. There's some things that are of issue there, because as we've seen lately, it's not hard to impact a riding. It's not too hard to have foreign interference within those races. So there's some things some checks and balances you have to address there. The idea as a whole is very interesting to me. I'd almost want to also take this another level. I would want this to take this to the Prime Minister itself. If 40% of the country was asking for an election, I think that would be necessary. I think that'd be the way to go. If 40% of the country was not happy and asking for an election, I think that should dissolve Parliament. There should be other ways to dissolve Parliament aside from a non-confidence vote, because as we've seen with Jagmeet and Trudeau, the system as it currently works doesn't fully work. These guys are colluding together to keep him and the Liberals in power. They have taken the say out of the people's hands altogether. So we should have a mechanism in place to remove the Prime Minister. That, in addition to this idea of removing MPs, I think that's a fantastic idea. I think, again, that returns power back to the people and let them have a say of who is going to represent them. Last but not least, this is the part that his final part of the essay that really caught my attention. He says, finally, I would make a personal commitment. I would resign after serving my second term in office. The beauty of genuine democracy is that it permits average citizens to serve their country in public office. Politics should not be a lifelong career, and elected officials should not be allowed to fix themselves in the halls of power of a nation. If they're permitted to do so, politicians will devote their time to finding ways to perpetuate their own power as opposed to building on the freedom of their country. Therefore, I would institute a limit of 2 terms for members of parliament and return the House of Commons to tax-paying citizens. Term limits, baby. We would love to see some term limits. It is really funny talking about lifelong politicians, as that is essentially what Pierre's become. I would be very interested if he had fallen through on these ideas as he gets into power. Would he be willing to do so? Would he fall the same way as Justin Trudeau did? Have all these amazing ideas before getting into power, then getting into power. Actually, it's kind of nice. I don't think we need voter reform. I kind of like this office chair. It's kind of nice in here. Could we see that happen? Or will Pierre Poilievre stick to what he talked about in this essay? I'd be curious. Term limits for our MPs is 100% necessary. It's been proven. Members of Parliament only having 2 terms, as he said, would return the House of Commons to tax-paying citizens. And we'd start refreshing and cycling through new faces, new people, bringing new ideas to the House of Commons on a consistent basis. And I think that's important. I think that is needed. Because as we've seen today, with not knowing what's going to happen with Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party this year, we know the latest we'll get an election is October. And we understand that the Prime Minister's office and the Liberal Party are not going to even allow Parliament to go into session to be able to issue a non-confidence vote. They're going to prorogue, they're going to do their leadership race, and we'll see how long that takes. At the end of the day, they've taken power away from normal Canadians. And what Poilievre shared in his essay, I'd be very interested in see him take those actions moving forward. And the nice part is we have it. We have the essay. We can hold him accountable the day he gets into power to see if he'd be willing to do these things, to return power back to the people. It's one thing if we've dug it up out of the archives and said, hey, you wrote this back in 99. What are you going to do about it? That's one thing. But when he took pride in the idea of what he wrote on his latest Jordan Peterson interview, then that adds more fuel to be able to take this essay and hold him accountable on it, to see if he'd be willing to make these moves once he gets into power. I'd be very curious to see him do it. The people need power back in their hands. This cannot be the norm anymore. This cannot happen again. Give power back to the people. Take it away from the globalists. Take it away from those who get too comfy in their chairs in politics. And let's keep this country free. For those interested in reading the whole article, we will post the link down in the show notes here as well. We actually will also have a link for those, because this is in the Internet Archive, so it's a little bit hard to actually read. So what we've done is we actually have created a Google Doc with it, and we'll post that link. So it's just easier to read in that way. So we hope you enjoy. Have yourselves a great day. We'll be keeping tuned to see when Trudeau announces his resignation today, and we'll be there covering it. Have yourselves a great day. I'm out.